Hello everyone, welcome to week 4 learning videos once again. This is learning objective 4. In this learning objective, we describe different ways to measure risk aversion. Thus far, we have seen that we can use a utility function to identify asset allocation for investors, provided that we are aware on what their degree of risk aversion actually is. The big question is how to actually go about measuring risk aversion, because risk aversion is an opaque concept that is actually not clearly defined. So if we think about measuring risk aversion, we can think about some similar types of concepts that aren't easily measurable and consider how they're measured. So one concept that might be considered to be akin to risk aversion is pain. We know that pain is something that is suffered to different degrees when we have different injuries, but pain is also something that we can't easily measure. We can't just stick a thermometer down someone's throat to identify how much pain that they might be in. So in pediatric medicine, when doctors try to measure the degree of pain that a child is feeling, they use something called Wong-Baker face pain rating. The Wong-Baker scale rates pain from 0 to 5. Actually, charts look at a range of different pictures you can see here in the screen, identify which of those images best reflect the current feeling and the level of pain that they are in. So this is an example of measuring a concept that is not directly measurable. What if we move to financial markets and think of how we measure an equivalent concept like risk aversion? Well, a very effective way to measure risk aversion is by looking at the price some individual investor will be willing to pay to participate in a gamble. Imagine a game of heads and tails where you flip a coin. If it lands head, you win $100, and if it lands tail, you win nothing. And imagine that you have to pay to enter that game. Now we know that the expected value of that coin toss game is $50 because there is a 50% chance of a head and 50% chance of a tail, and we had a payoff of $100 and $0. Therefore, if you are risk neutral, you would be willing to participate in that game for the price of $50. That is, you would be willing to pay the expected return in order to take on that risk. However, given investors are risk averse, they would normally only participate in that game if they could pay an amount less than $50. But the amount less than 50 that you will be willing to pay in order to play that game gives you a measure of your degree of risk aversion. So someone who has a very low degree of risk aversion and that is a coefficient of risk aversion equals to, say, for example, 1, she might be willing to play the game if it costs, say, $45. To play someone with slightly higher degree of risk aversion, say 2 or 3, they might be willing to play the game if it costs, say, $40. Someone who is highly risk averse, let's say an A equals to 5, she might be willing to play the game if it costs only about $50 to $20. So we can translate the price that you are willing to pay compared to what the expected value of the risk payoff is as a measure of your degree of risk aversion. Another way to look at the degree of risk aversion of investor is to infer it from their investment decision making. The easiest way to think about this is to look at how an individual investor allocates their superannuation. So for most superannuation funds, there is a range of different options, range of different buckets. They have different asset allocations which an investor can choose between. Take UniSuper, for example. UniSuper has 8 different investment choices: cash, capital stable, conservative balance, socially responsible balanced growth, socially responsible high growth, and high growth. So as we move here from top to bottom, expected return will increase to cover up higher risk associated with each of these portfolios. So if an investor elected to invest in cash or capital stable, we could assume that she is highly risk averse investor. If an investor decided to invest in high growth, for example, we could have said that the investor has a low degree of risk aversion. So as we move down here and see the asset allocation into different asset classes under different portfolio choices, we can see that as we move down, risk is increases because we are allocating higher wealth to risky assets, for example, equities. Like for capital stable, you can see 20% of the fund is invested in equities only, whereas the remaining 80% is invested in other alternatives. Whereas for high growth, for example, a larger proportion, more than 70%, invested in equities, whereas there are only a smaller proportion, like less than 30%, is invested in other alternatives. To think about the choice in terms of utility calculation, let's imagine that investor make a choice across each of these asset classes because that is the selection that maximizes utility. So we can use that utility maximization function to identify what must be the coefficient of risk aversion for that particular investor such that asset allocation is maximizing utility. So we can assume that target performance of each of these funds is the expected return of the fund, which is a combination of a consumer price index, I mean the inflation rate, plus an additional return. And we can use the weightings that is stipulated previously, UniSuper, in terms of breakup between the defensive and growth assets. You can see here the allocation in the risky portfolio and the risk-free assets. So what we can infer from this calculation here, I am assuming that the market risk premium is 6% and the standard deviation is 20%. We can back out that if an investor is investing in the capital stable fund, that implies that she has a coefficient of risk aversion of 5. If we solve for A from that utility function formula. And if the investor is investing in a higher growth, that appears that the coefficient of risk aversion of the investor is 1.5. So we can use the actual decision, the actual processes made by investors as a way of backing out and calculating their degree of risk aversion. Another common technique that is also used by a lot of financial planners is to use surveys to measure people's risk tolerance. So we can see here an example of a survey, a range of questions that give a measure of an individual's appetite towards risk. Across each of them, you could add up how many points the individual scores, and we could see different values of points might relate to different degrees of risk aversion. So scoring very highly means you have got a very low A, so you are an aggressive investor. A low score means you are very conservative, has a high degree of risk aversion. So that's all of our discussion on this learning objective. So please watch the next video for our discussion on subsequent learning objectives. Thank you.